Hi, we're here today with Praveen Bunava, and he's going to talk about SQL always-on best practices around availability groups. And first of all, how does NetBackup support it?
So NetBackup started supporting SQL always-on availability groups since NetBackup 7.7.1. So one of the things we do is basically use the same methodology that we used within SQL Server before, and we can enhance that to protect SQL Server availability groups as well. So when you look at that simple example that I talked earlier, which is primarily talking about SQL availability groups, you have a node A, node B that's a clustered instance, which also contains a primary replica. It's also called a primary database, also a primary replica. And then you have a secondary replica that sits in a different node, which could be on a different data center as well. So to protect this specific environment, what you would do is typically install NetBackup on the node A and node B, which basically would also contain a backup SQL agent. Now, from a protection standpoint for the availability groups, the system and user databases as they are, you can protect them like traditionally you protected before, which is using NetBackup or SQL agent. From an availability group standpoint, what we do is primarily go and configure. There are two choices to do it, actually. The first choice is using what we call as a backup preferences set by the SQL administrator, or the second option is by using a specific node. And within that backup preferences, within the SQL Management Studio, the SQL Server admin can define which one is a preferred replica to actually protect the data from an availability group standpoint. So when they define that preferred replica, we want to make sure from when the backup protects it, we need to define all the nodes within the policy within the client's list. So if you don't define all the nodes within the client list, you might miss out the preferred replica component. And the backup, when it protects the backup of that, does the backup of the availability groups, it doesn't really identify what that preferred replica is unless you specifically define that in the batch script. And the second thing, we also make sure that if the node is not in that specific list of clients within the client list, we might miss the actual backup of the availability group itself. So you need to make sure all the nodes that are part of the availability group should always be defined as part of the client list within that policy. So that's probably one of the main things you want to keep in mind when configuring a backup policy for SQL that's leveraging availability groups. They have two choices here, obviously. You can protect it from a primary replica, or you can protect it from a secondary replica. Once the SQL admin has defined which one is this preferred replica, you always want to make sure that node is as part of the client list. That's one crucial component. And the second component is to make sure, as far as the type of backup you're doing, we support full backups, differential backups. But for full backups, we could do it from either one of the copies, from primary or from the secondary. But when we do it from a secondary, it's what we call as a copy-only backup. So it's all data that protecting from the secondary piece of it, secondary component of it. When we go to the differential, you can only do it at the primary. You can't do it on the secondary at all. So you want to do a differential only on the primary replica. That's the gist of how you protect the actual availability groups using NetBackup.
So that's great information, Praveen. So in NetBackup, we have a great feature called SQL Intelligent Policies. Can you talk a little bit about how that's pertains here to availability groups?
So, since NetBackup or SQL availability groups were introduced in 7.7.1, we haven't really done any development for the SQL Intelligent Policy auto detection of the SQL instances that contain availability groups. So with 7.7.1, we do not support SQL Intelligent Policies for the availability groups. In the future, we're planning on supporting it. So today, you have to use traditional batch files to back up the actual availability groups. But you do have an option when you go to the SQL policy. There's in the client list, from when you define which clients you're protecting, you want to define clients with batch files. And you have to create the batch file either using the SQL Management Studio, or you create using Notepad and defining the way you've done it before.
So that's great information, Praveen. Thank you very much for sharing the best practices.
Thanks.